I was sitting there on my porch that morning, just minding my own business and nursing a cold bottle of Shinerbach like any retired frame carpenter with a bad back and half a working spine would do, when suddenly these two county cruisers come screaming up my gravel driveway like they just gotten a call about a high-stakes hostage situation. I'm talking dust flying everywhere, gravel hitting the underside of my truck, and these two officers jumping out with their hands already hovering over their belts, flashlights up in the daylight. Wearing those faces, they probably spent an hour practicing in the locker room mirror to look as intimidating as humanly possible. One of them, a kid who looked like he hadn't even started shaving yet, yells at me to step away from the property because I'm in, quote, trespassing on HOA land, end quote. I just sat there for a second, blinking twice, looking down at my grease-stained work boots, which were currently resting on a cedar porch that I personally cut, sanded, and nailed into place with my own two hands. I looked back up at them, took a slow sip of my beer, and said, end quote, well, hell, boys, if this ain't my property, then I'd really like to know which one of you geniuses has been paying my mortgage for the last 3 years because I'd love a refund, end quote. Before those two could even figure out how stupid they sounded, I saw her, Evelyn, the HOA president, coming power walking out from behind the trees like a raccoon that had accidentally found a pair of expensive yoga pants and a gallon of espresso. She was stabbing the air with her finger, pointing at me like I was a rabid rat in a dumpster, screaming at the top of her lungs for them to arrest me because I, end quote, didn't own this land anymore, end quote. Now, I didn't know whether to laugh, choke on my drink, or ask her if she'd accidentally snorted a line of lawn fertilizer before her morning jog, but right then, a quiet, cold realization settled in the center of my chest, and I realized they weren't just enforcing some petty neighborhood rules. They weren't protecting the, end quote, community spirit, end quote, they always bragged about in the newsletters. They were trying to take my peace away from me, 1 inch of soil at a time, and I knew right then and there that I had to stand up. I stood up slow, feeling every one of my 54 years in my knees, wiped the sawdust off my jeans, and stared right at the badge of the older cop, the one who looked like he actually knew better, and I didn't oppose. TL didn't oppose. T create a scene, I just gave him one sentence. I told him, end quote, you boys are about to learn real quick that you picked the wrong man's porch to stand on, end quote. That moment right there was where this whole damn mess truly started. And if you've got a minute to sit with me, I'll tell you exactly how a simple cedar porch, a dirt trail leading down to the water, and one red metal sign turned my quiet retirement into the most ridiculous, high-stakes fight I've had since my divorce finalized. See, I bought this place, 5 acres of Blackwood Ridge, because I was tired and I'd done an oppos. Do you mean the kind of tired a nap can fix? I mean the kind of bone-deep exhaustion you get after 30 years of swinging a hammer, hauling lumber, and dealing with a marriage that collapsed into a heap of legal papers and bitter silences. My boys were grown and gone, living their lives in different time zones, which is exactly what I raised them to do, but it leaves a man with a lot of empty evenings and a lot of quiet air in his lungs. When I found this land, tucked behind a line of ancient, gnarled oaks that creaked in the wind like they were telling old secrets, I felt something I hadn't in oppos. Felt in a decade. I felt peace. There was a narrow creek running along the south side, and if the wind shifted just right, you could smell the lake water and the pine needles before you even saw the shore. In the late summer, the sky turned this deep, bruised gold color that made you feel like the whole world was finally telling you to slow down. I built the house myself. No fancy crews, no shiny clipboards, just me, my tools, and whatever was left of my pride. And for a while, it was perfect. The neighbors from the independent plots would wave. The folks from town would stop by to tell me the place looked solid. And I'd wake up with the sun pushing through the blinds, stepping barefoot onto those boards, feeling like I'd finally outrun the noise of the world. But peace is a funny thing. It doesn't in oppos. Tea just vanish in a puff of smoke. It erodes slowly, quietly like water, eating away at a foundation until one day you realize the whole thing is tilting. The first crack was that trail, a simple, dusty little shortcut that cut across the back corner of my land and headed straight down toward the lake. I didn't oppose. Mind at first. Really, I didn't oppose. I figured if a few hikers or kids on bikes wanted a shorter path to the water, what was the harm? But as I sat on that porch, after the police had finally backed off that morning, more confused and victorious, I realized a hard truth I should have seen months ago. The moment you let people treat your land like it belongs to everyone, it's only a matter of time before someone decides it doesn't at Oppos. T belonged to you at all. Summer made the trail louder, and with the noise came the trash, and I'm not just talking about a stray soda can here or there. I started finding plastic wrappers, cigarette butts, and eventually the absolute final straw, a used diaper shoved under the roots of one of my favorite maples. I'd worked construction long enough to step in things most people couldn't in Oppos. T pronounce. But nothing prepares you for the sheer insult of finding a stranger in Oppos. S filth on the land you bled for. A few days after the diaper incident, I heard this sharp, entitled laughter coming from the woods, and when I walked down there, I found 3 teenage boys hurling empty glass bottles against the rocks like they were trying to win a prize. I walked up slow, hands in my pockets, and told them to pick it up because they were on private property, and this one kid, a tall, shaggy hair blonde wearing sneakers that probably cost more than my first truck, just grinned at me like I was a fly he was about to swat. He told me to, and quote, "Relax, old man," and quote, because everyone used the trail, and when I told him I'd call the sheriff if they didn't in Oppos, to clean up the glass, he leaned in and said, and quote, "My mom is the HOA president, so we're basically allowed to be anywhere we want," end quote. I just looked at him, feeling that familiar heat rising up the back of my neck, and I told him, and quote, "Son, you and Oppos, we're only allowed to be here if I say so, and right now I'm saying you're leaving," end quote. They left, grumbling and cursing under their breath, but the blonde one tossed a line over his shoulder that felt like a storm cloud rolling in. He said, and quote, "We in Oppos, LLC about that," end quote. And sure enough, by sunset, Evelyn was at my door. She didn't in Oppos. T asked what happened. She didn't in Oppos. T apologized for her son's behavior. She just stood there on my welcome mat with 1 foot forward like she was claiming my house for the HOA, accusing me of, end quote, harassing minors, end quote, and, end quote, blocking a historical community asset, end quote. She had this look in her eyes, the kind you only see in people who have never been told in Oppos, no in Oppos, in their entire lives, and she told me that the trail had been used for 20 years, and therefore it was, and, quote, practically public, end quote. I remember leaning against the door frame, taking a slow breath, and telling her that, end quote, practically, end quote, ISN in Oppos, T illegal term on a deed, and that if she didn't end Oppos, T keep her kids and her community off my soil, she was going to find out exactly how much a retired carpenter values his privacy. She didn't end Oppos, T like that. She hissed at me, telling me I had no idea who I was dealing with, the classic HOA war cry, and marched off, her ponytail bouncing with every angry step. That night, the first, end quote, message, end quote, appeared. I woke up to find a dozen beer cans lined up neatly right under my, end quote, private property, end quote, sign, not tossed there but placed like a dare. The next night, it was worse, more trash, more glass, and even a spray-painted, end quote, X, end quote, on one of my oaks. I realized then that I wasn't in Oppos. T dealing with a misunderstanding, I was dealing with a group of people who believed their social status gave them a right to my labor and my land. So I did what any man with a shed full of tools and a bag of concrete would do. I went out and bought the biggest, baddest red metal, end quote, no trespassing, end quote, sign I could find, and I didn't in Oppos. T just screw into a post. I dug a 3-foot hole, mixed a fresh batch of gray concrete, and set that thing in the ground like I was planting a flag on Iwo Jima. I ran at my neighbor, Silas, a retired mechanic who'd lived in the area since before the HOA, was even a glimmer in some developer's eye, and he just watched me work while chewing on a piece of hay. He told me, and quote, "Ron, you know you and Oppos. Repoking the nest, right? That woman thinks she's the queen of the county, and she's got half the local PD on her Christmas card list." End quote. I told Silas I didn't in Oppos. T care if she was the queen of England. She wasn't Oppos. T the queen of my 5 acres. And he just shook his head and said, and quote, "Just be ready because people like that don in Oppos. T back down, they double down, and they'll use every dirty trick in the book to make you the villain of the story." End quote. He was right, of course. 2 days later, that's when the end quote, compliance division, end quote, letter arrived. 3 pages of cold, corporate threats claiming I was in violation of community easements and demanding I remove the unauthorized obstruction within 48 hours or face legal action. I sat at my kitchen table, looking at that letter, and then at the phone call I got from an unknown number 5 minutes later, a voice just saying, take it down or we'll take it down for you, That was the moment I stopped being, polite retired Ron, and started being, construction site foreman Ron, I call my old friend Miller, a guy who's forgotten more about property law than most attorneys will ever know, and he told me one thing, get eyes on it, Ron. You're going to try something stupid, and you need to make sure the whole world sees it when they do. I spent the next morning installing 4 high-definition night vision cameras, one on the trail, one on the porch, one on the driveway, and one hidden in the oaks. I spent a fortune, but like I always say, you can end oppos. T put a price on the look on a bully and oppos' face when they realize they're being recorded. The climax of this whole circus happened on a Tuesday night. I was watching a live feed on my tablet when I saw them, Evelyn's husband and 2 other guys from the HOA board, carrying a crowbar and a heavy-duty bolt cutter, heading straight for my sign. They were laughing, talking about how they were going to, teach the old man a lesson, and how they'd have the police back out the next morning to finish the job. I didn't oppose. T run out there screaming. I didn't oppose. T grabbed a shotgun. I just sat in the dark on my porch, quiet as a ghost, and waited. I watched them struggle for 20 minutes trying to pry that concrete set post out of the ground, swearing and sweating in their polo shirts, until finally I just flicked on the industrial-grade floodlights I'd rigged up. They froze like deer in the headlights, squinting and shielding their eyes, and I just stepped into the light and said, evening, boys. Hope you're enjoying the workout, but just so you know, you're currently being broadcast live to a cloud server, and my lawyer is already watching, The look on Evelyn's husband's face was worth every penny I'd spent on the cameras. It was a mixture of pure terror and a realization that the old man wasn't oppos. T is easy to push over as they thought. I told them they had 30 seconds to drop the tools and get off my land before I pressed send on the police report for attempted vandalism and trespassing, and you've never seen 3 middle-aged men move so fast in your life. But here's the kicker. The next morning, the police did show up, but it wasn't oppos. T the 2 kids from before. It was the sheriff himself, and he wasn't oppos. T there to arrest me. He had a copy of the video I'd sent Miller, and he had some very pointed questions for the HOA board about why they were trespassing on private property with intent to destroy land. It's been quiet lately, almost too quiet. The trail is overgrown now because I put up a fence that actually follows the deed line to the inch, and Evelyn hasn't oppos. T walked past my house in months. I still sit on my porch, still drink my beer, and still watch the golden sun sink behind the oaks, but I know this ISN and oppos. T really over. Folks like that, they just go underground for a while, waiting for you to get comfortable so they can find a new loophole or a new way to make your life difficult. It makes me wonder, though, why is it that some people feel like they have a right to what someone else worked for? Is it just the power of the HOA, or is it something deeper in the way we treat our neighbors these days? I'm curious to know if any of you have dealt with Karen, or an HOA that thought they owned the dirt under your feet, because I'm starting to think I'm not the only one fighting this kind of battle. Was I too harsh, or did I do what needed to be done to keep my peace? Drop a comment and let me know what you would have done if those cruisers pulled up on your porch. I got a feeling I'm going to be reading some wild stories tonight.